So you just now became aware of the new provision that GAR added last year regarding a seller's contribution to a buyer's closing costs and a buyer being able to use them for the buyer's brokerage commission. How does that work? Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, director of the Real Estate Academy of America, here to talk about that issue. So let me read you first what it says, and then we'll have a brief discussion about it. So in the GAR, Georgia Association of Realtors Purchase and Sale Agreement, GAR F201, on paragraph A3 is where a buyer and seller negotiate a dollar amount that a seller is contributing to a buyer's closing costs. Just parenthetically, buyer's agents, you need to check with that buyer's lender because the total amount of outside contributions a buyer can receive is limited by the type of loan a buyer is getting and the amount the buyer is putting down. But back to the discussion at hand. So you negotiate that dollar amount under paragraph A3. Then under paragraph B3, you read seller's contribution at closing. At closing, seller shall make the referenced seller's monetary contribution, which the buyer may use to pay any cost or expense of a buyer related to this transaction, including, without limitation, any commission obligations of the buyer. Buyer acknowledges that buyer's mortgage lender may not allow the seller's monetary contribution or the full amount thereof to be used for some costs or expenses. In such event, any unused portion of the seller's monetary contribution shall remain the property of the seller. So today's video is specifically talking about what does that mean, including without limitation, any commission obligation of the buyer. Well, so you're thinking, wow, if the seller is making a contribution negotiated, let's say the seller negotiated to pay $10,000 towards the buyer's closing costs, and their closing costs only totaled up to $9,000. May I use that? On the closing statement, can the closing attorney attribute that additional $1,000 to the buyer's broker commission and save my buyer $1,000 and save my buyer $1,000? Can that be used towards a commission obligation? The answer is not an outright yes or no. You have to understand that it states the commission obligation of a buyer. So that backs up to the brokerage agreements that a buyer signed, the buyer brokerage agreement that a buyer signed. So you're working with a buyer, and a buyer agreed in the brokerage agreement that you negotiated, your broker negotiated with that buyer. The buyer agreed that for your services to help them purchase a home, they agreed to pay you for apples. And then you find a property that the buyer wants to purchase, and in the information in the MLS service or directly in talking with the seller's broker, you have determined that the seller's broker and or seller are sharing the commission with the buyer's broker, and they are sharing 4 apples with the buyer's broker at the closing of this transaction. So here's where we are in this example. The buyer agreed that your services are worth 4 apples. The seller side, either the seller's broker or the seller or combination thereof, have also agreed that your services for bringing a buyer to consummate this deal and go to closing are worth 4 apples. So you are getting paid, your broker is getting paid 4 apples from the seller side. Therefore, is there now a commission obligation on behalf of your buyer? The answer is no. So there is no obligation left over for your buyer at closing. So any additional apples that the seller had negotiated towards the buyer's closing costs. If let's say, back to closing costs, $10,000 the seller had agreed to contribute, and the actual closing costs were only $9,000. There's no commission obligation on behalf of your buyer, so the additional $1,000 will get attributed as a seller credit back on the closing statement. That's scenario number one. Now, scenario number two. Let's say, same thing, buyer, you have negotiated, your broker has negotiated with the buyer that your services to help them find a house, negotiate a contract, get it closed, and all of the work that entails is worth 4 apples. The buyer has agreed that those services are worth 4 apples, and they will pay you 4 apples, offset by any apples you receive from the seller side in combination of the seller's broker and or the seller. They find a house they want to purchase, and you inform them, and you find out that the seller side, in combination of the seller's broker and the seller, they are only paying your broker 3 apples, the buyer's broker, they're only paying them 3 apples to go to closing. So the buyer said your services, and they obligated themselves to pay you 4 apples. Their 4 apples they owe is offset by the 3 apples your broker is receiving from the seller side. There's a discrepancy of 1 apple. In that scenario, if the seller's contribution to the buyer's closing costs are more than what the lender's actual closing costs are, if there is an apple left over, then that seller's contribution to closing costs can be used to offset the buyer's now obligation to pay you that 1 additional apple. So it's not just an outright commission payment. It is only if there is a buyer obligation to pay a commission based on what they had signed in their buyer brokerage agreement, offset by any commission the buyer's broker is being compensated from the selling side of the deal. Woo! Hope you understand that. Hope that helps explain that just a little bit better. Thank you all so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, director of the Real Estate Academy of America, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Bye. If you like that video, check out the one here. If you like the content on this entire channel, please click here to subscribe. I try to take even the most complicated of real estate situations and make them crystal clear. See what I did there? Real estate made crystal clear. Thank you guys so much for watching.